First thing he felt was the cold. Not winter and not nighttime, the cold from within, as if my bones have frozen right through and now are slowly crumbling under the skin. Then a sound, a wheeze, a wet and heavy. Someone nearby was dying. He tried to open his eyes and realized that he was he himself. The air flowed into lungs as through a rag. Every breath was taken with pain. Every exhalation ended a gurgling sound somewhere deep in chest. He lay on straw. The straw was damp and smelled of urine and rot. The ceiling above my head was low and black from soot. Hands. He raised his hands and didn't recognize them. Slender, childlike, transparent fingers with dirt under chipped nails. On my wrists, on scars from ropes. He tried sit, and body didn't obey. I fell back onto side and started coughing like that, in my eyes went dark. On straw in my lay phlegm, brown, with red strands of blood. He stared at her, and his brain kicked in before then panic. Purulent with blood, rusty tint. Staphylococcus or streptococcus, lower lobe pneumonia, more likely right-sided, without antibiotics the 80%. He blinked. Where did he? How a 12-year-old boy in a slave's shirt knows the word staphylococcus. And then memory flooded in two streams at once. In one thread was Kai, a slave who made beds on the Baron Varina's purchased 3 winters ago at the bloat for half a silver coin. Work to clean for the master's dogs, and make the bed for my son the master's on cold nights. He coughs in the fall. The doctor told the cook not spend on it food until spring at last. On second wave was Ethan Reed, 34 years old, Boston, laboratory in 3rd floor. Thesis on the mechanisms of action of penicillins. Grant for research telomerase. 14 hours under the microscope. The trip home. Light headlights from a car. That's it. 2 streams collided and became one. Ethan Reed lay in body of a slave boy and looked at his own bloody sputum with an expression that neither single child in this world could have depicted. A cold calculation. He looked at sputum. The color spoke of a bacterial infection, not a virus, a bacterium. And bacteria can be killed, if there is a way. He didn't had anything. There's lab, no reagents, not even pure water. And he had a body that weighed kilograms 30 and was dying right. And head in which were all knowledge of biology 21st century. He closed his and began count. Penicillin. Mold of the genus Penicillium. Grows on bread in warm, moist environment. Incubation from 5 to 14 days. Then you have to get liquid culture. Then filtration. Then evaporation. 6 weeks minimum until the first working batch. 6 weeks. At Kaya of these 6 weeks, so we have to win time by means. Drainage position. Lie in your side so that the affected lung is on top. Plenty of warm drink if you manage get some. Honey if there is any. Honey is a natural antiseptic and even some calories. Ethan rolled over onto his side. His right lung was wheezing more. That means the right lung. He lay correctly and felt as if breathed a little easier. A little, with half a breath. But in his position, half a breath is the difference between life and death. Behind the wall, footsteps. Heavy. The door. In small room entered a woman wearing a red face and a bucket of slop. The cook, Brigitte. In memory of Kaya prompted the name. She looked at the boy, at straw, as they look at dead cat, with a touch irritation that I'll have to clean up. She said that again, all straw spit with blood, and that if he dies, then let die behind barn or not in the house. Ethan looked at her through Kaya's and thought, this woman every day has access to the kitchen, to bread, to honey, to warm water. He needs this woman. He peeled his lips and said that the rats in the basement are gnawing the flour. He said that he knows how to get, but he needs some bread. Moldy, the kind is thrown away. Brigida looked at him with suspicion. The boy who 3 months had been flat and coughed up when suddenly he spoke. And he began not that as he usually did, not in a quiet voice of a frightened slave, but calmly, just a person who definitely knows what he needs. She snorted and said that moldy bread in the basement even there were, and even if from the rats doesn't get rid, then one will go instead bread. She went out. Ethan closed his eyes, and for the first time for both of his incarnations, he smiled. Moldy bread. This is the beginning. Now he needs a warm place where no one won't it goes. The stable. Memory Kaya revealed a distant corner behind the boxes with harness where the grooms don't go for weeks. Warmth from the horses. Humidity. Darkness. Ideal conditions for the growth mold. It had been lying there until evening. The cough wouldn't let up, but the drainage position helped. The phlegm came up more easily. When it got dark, he got up. His legs wouldn't hold him. He clung to the wall and took his first step, then a second. Every step sent a wave of pain through his chest. It was 30 steps across the yard to the kitchen. He counted. On the 18th step, he stopped and doubled over from a coughing fit. On the 25th, he leaned against the wall of the shed and just breathed for a minute. On the 30th, he entered the kitchen. Brigida was gone. On the table stood a bowl with the remains of some soup. Ethan ate everything that was there. His stomach cramped from lack of habit. Kai hadn't eaten properly in a long time. Then he found what he'd come for. In the corner by the wall stood a basket with pieces of bread set aside to be thrown away. Mold. Green and white. He sorted through the pieces carefully. Green with a blue tinge. It might be penicillium. He took 3 pieces and hid them in his shirt. On the shelf he found a jar of honey. He dipped his finger in and licked it. Then again. Honey is an antiseptic for the throat and a source of energy. He took a small clay pot from the stack by the stove. No one counts the clay pots in the big kitchen. Then he walked back across the yard. 30 steps. This time he stopped only twice. It was another 50 steps to the stable. He made it. The far corner behind the crates turned out to be exactly as Kai's memory had shown. Warm from the wall behind which the horses stood. Dark, cluttered with old hay and scraps of harness. Ethan sat down on the floor. He laid out the pieces of bread. He chose the one where the green mold was thickest. He carefully broke off a piece with the densest colony and placed it in the clay pot. He needed a culture medium. Barley broth would do. There was barley in the kitchen. Tomorrow. For now, the main thing was to get the process started. He covered the pot with a piece of cloth and placed it in the corner right by the wall, where it was warmest. Then he lay down next to it on the hay and started coughing. For a long time. Painfully. The phlegm was the same brown color. But he was alive. And he had a plan. 6 weeks until the first batch of penicillin. If he could survive 6 weeks, he could survive 6 centuries. He closed his eyes. A single thought swirled in his head. In a normal lab, he'd have an autoclave, a laminar flow cabinet, and a chromatograph. Here, he had a clay pot and moldy bread. In his past life, he wouldn't even have been given an internship for something like this. Here, his life depended on it. He exhaled hoarsely and whispered into the darkness. "Hi, Kai. My name is Ethan. I'm going to live for both of us. You don't mind, do you?" No one answered. Only the horse behind the wall shifted from one foot to the other. The days that followed became a routine of survival. In the morning, Ethan lay in his tiny room, coughing. During the day, he would go out, ostensibly to clean the yard. In reality, every outing was an operation. He stole barley from the kitchen by the handful. He hid it in his shirt. He boiled it over coals behind the stable when no one was looking. He strained it through a rag and poured the broth into a pot with mold. He monitored the temperature. He moved the pot closer to the wall or farther away, depending on the weather. By the end of the first week, the mold had started to grow. A green velvet covered the surface of the broth in an even layer. Ethan looked at it and nodded. Penicillium. Almost certainly. Of course, without a microscope, he couldn't be 100% sure. But the characteristic color, texture, and smell pointed to the right strain. He started a second culture in another pot, and a third. The more parallel batches, the higher the chance that at least one would yield a usable extract. At the same time, he was fighting pneumonia with his bare hands. The drainage position, warm drinks, honey, which he stole by the spoonful, breathing exercises. He forced himself to cough deliberately to clear phlegm from his lungs. It was agonizing, but he knew that stagnant phlegm kills faster than the infection itself. In the second week, a small miracle occurred. His body temperature dropped, though not back to normal, but the fever had receded from deadly to merely unpleasant. Kai's immune system was young, 12 years old. His thymus was working at full capacity. T-cell production was at its peak. The boy's body was fighting on its own. Ethan was just helping him do it right. By the third week, he could walk across the yard without stopping. By the fourth week, his cough had turned dry. The phlegm had lightened in color. Brigida looked at him with superstitious horror. The boy whom the doctor had written off as dead had gotten back on his feet and was walking. She told the other servants that the saints must have taken him in. Ethan didn't argue. Let them think whatever they wanted. By the fifth week, he drained the liquid from the first pot. It was yellow with a distinctive odor. He filtered it through 4 layers of linen cloth. Then he filtered it again through a layer of charcoal he'd found at the blacksmith shop. He ended up with about 3 spoonfuls of a cloudy liquid. He sniffed it. He held it up to the light. By all appearances, it was a crude penicillin extract, impure, weak. In his old lab, they would have poured something like this down the sink without a second thought. Here, it was a treasure. He began taking 3 drops on his tongue every 4 hours. The taste was disgusting, bitter and earthy, with a hint of mold. He endured it. By the 6th week, the cough had almost stopped. There was no more phlegm. His breathing had cleared up. Ethan sat in his corner of the stable and listened to the air entering and leaving his lungs. Freely, without wheezing, without pain. He had survived. Kai had survived. Now he could think about the next step. On 7th week, at estate brought Lucas, the older son, Verena. The boy was 8 years old. They was dragged on stretcher, and a scream could be heard from the gate all the way at the stables. Ethan stood by the water trough for horses and soap-hand when 2 soldiers carried by him a screaming child. He saw a leg, the right one. From the knee to the foot, the skin was red and swollen. In the center of his, a burn, measuring the palm an adult man's. The edges of the wound were wet and grayish-green. The smell hit even from 3 steps away, sweet and nauseating. Ethan knew that smell. Anaerobic infection. Putrefactive bacteria have devoured dead tissue and were moving deeper. If the process goes to the bone, osteomyelitis, then sepsis, then death. He learned the details from kitchen staff over dinner. Lucas played in the kitchen in the estate and knocked over onto himself a kettle with boiling oil. This was 10 days ago. The local doctor applied ointment to the wound with grease and wrapped dirty cloth. The wound became infected on the 3rd day. On 7th day, began speak about amputation. Baron Varon plunged his son onto stretcher and took him home. Home because that if the boy dies, then let die in his father's house. Ethan lay on his straw and thought. He had 4 pots with mold extract, about 200 milliliters of coarse penicillin. It didn't know the exact concentration. He knew purity. I didn't will or be for the child with common anaerobic infection. But he knew that without Lucas's Lucas, he would lose his leg, or even his life. In the morning, the court arrived from the city. Ethan saw him through the window of the little room. A man in black robe with a leather suitcase. The doctor got up to Lucas's and was there for an hour. Then I went into the Baron and started talking to the Baron. Ethan didn't hear the words, but saw the Baron's mithed to give the Baron. It turned gray. The doctor pointed with his hands. It was clear what. Cut. Amputate below the knee. Baron Varon stood in the courtyard of his estate, and he looked like a man who had been hit on the back of the head on head. His only son, his heir, 8 years old. Ethan made a decision. He knew that this madness, he slave, a 12-year-old boy in tattered shirt. He will come to the Baron, who can order to have him flog for one wrong glance. And what that? He might save him son. If he makes a mistake, Lucas will die, and Ethan will be hanged. If remains silent, Lucas will lose his leg, and maybe even his life, and Ethan will remain a slave who knows how to treat, but to whom no one will to treat. He went out into courtyard. The Baron was standing alone. The doctor had gone to prepare his instruments. Ethan approached, barefoot feet across the cold stones. The Baron looked at him from above. His eyes are red. His cheekbones are clenched. He clearly did not understand that a slave needs in such moment. Ethan said that he might help his son. The Baron did not answer. He just stared. Ethan said that he knew how to treat infected wounds. What he need, 2 days. If in 2 days the boy doesn't beget, let the doctor cut it out. He said that nothing has asked for it, only 2 days. Baron Varon was a harsh and clever. He didn't believe in miracles. He did not believe the slave boys. But his son shouted behind the wall, and the doctor was sharpening a saw. And the Baron made that father's fathers when a choice left. He nodded. Ethan went up to Lucas's chambers. The room smelled of pus and burnt flesh. A pale boy lay on the bed with his eyes closed. He wasn't screaming anymore. He had no strength left. A maid stood nearby, wiping his forehead with a wet cloth. Ethan looked at the wound. It was worse than he'd thought. Necrosis had spread 5 centimeters around the burn. The skin was black and soft. Beneath it was a pool of pus. The edges were red and hot. The inflammation was spreading upward toward the knee. A red streak ran across the skin. Lymphangitis. The infection had already reached the lymphatic system. 2 more days and it would be in his bloodstream. Ethan got to work. First, he asked for boiled water. The maid looked at him as if he were crazy. He explained that the water had to be boiled and then cooled. Pure. Nothing else. Then he needed salt. Coarse. Table salt. And honey. Lots of honey. and clean rags.
Not just any rags, but ones boiled in water and dried. The maid left to fetch the water, and he was left alone with the boy. He carefully removed the old bandage. The fabric had dried to the wound, and Lucas groaned even through his unconsciousness. Under the bandage was a mess of lard, pus, and dead skin. Ethan silently uttered a few words that, in his past life, he'd only ever said while stuck in traffic on the Massachusetts Turnpike. Lard on an open burn wound. The healer had effectively created the perfect breeding ground for bacteria. Warm, greasy, sealed off from the air. The anaerobic bacteria were in for a feast. When they brought boiled water, Ethan began to rinse the wound. Slowly, carefully. With a saline solution, about 9 grams of salt per liter of water, an isotonic solution. In his old lab, there had been a measuring flask for this. Here, he measured out the salt by pinches and tasted the solution. It had to taste like a tear. He rinsed for a long time, washing away the pus and dead tissue. Lucas groaned and writhed. Ethan asked the maid to hold the boy by the shoulders. Once the wound was clean, he examined it again. It was better than it had appeared under the bandage. The necrosis was deep, but the bone was intact. Blood flow below the wound was preserved. The toes were pale but warm. The foot could be saved. He applied a thin layer of honey to the wound. Honey is an osmotic antiseptic. Its high sugar concentration draws water out of bacterial cells and kills them. Plus, there's the hydrogen peroxide that honey releases in small amounts. This isn't a textbook. It works. Then he pulled a small vial from his bosom, his precious extract, crude penicillin. 4 weeks of work in the stable. He dripped it right into the wound, 10 drops. Then he applied a clean, boiled bandage. And he began giving Lucas the medicine. 3 drops of the extract per spoonful of water every 4 hours. The maid watched him with a mixture of horror and admiration. Who was this boy? How did he know what he was doing? Ethan didn't explain. He just got to work. The first night was rough. Lucas was burning up. His fever had risen even higher. This was to be expected. Cleaning the wound had disturbed the infection, and the bacteria had released a dose of toxins into his bloodstream. His immune system responded with a fever. Ethan sat nearby, changing the wet cloths on the boy's forehead. 3 drops every 4 hours. A check on the wound every 2 hours. By morning, the fever hadn't gone down. The Baron stopped by twice. He stood in the doorway, looking at his son and at the slave boy sitting by his bed with a clay flask in his hands. He said nothing. He left. The second night, the fever began to drop. Slowly. 10 degrees per hour. Ethan hadn't slept for 30 hours and was checking Lucas's pulse every half hour. The pulse was slowing. That's good. The tachycardia is subsiding. The body is stopping its emergency response. On the morning of the 3rd day, Ethan changed the bandage and saw what he wanted to see. The edges of the wound had turned pink. There was less pus. The redness around it had begun to recede. The red streak of lymphangitis had faded. The penicillin was working. Rough, impure, grown in a clay pot in a stable. But it was working. It was killing the bacteria that were killing this boy. By the 5th day, Lucas opened his eyes and asked for water. By the 7th, he demanded food. He didn't understand what had happened. He remembered the pain and the fever and the darkness. And then he woke up, and sitting next to him was a thin boy who smelled of mold and looked at him as if he could see right through him. Baron Verena entered the room on the 7th day. His son was sitting in bed eating porridge. His leg was bandaged with a clean cloth. The skin around the bandage was pink and healthy, not black. The Baron knelt down.
Not before an icon, before a 12-year-old slave in a tattered shirt. This man, whom people called Varin the Wolf to his face, the one who led soldiers into battle and hanged bandits without trial, knelt there, unable to utter a single word. Ethan looked at him and said nothing, not a word of thanks, nor about the miracle. He said one thing. He needed a private room, with a south-facing window, warm and dry, and no one was to enter it without his permission. The Baron nodded. By evening that day, Ethan had moved his pots from the stable to a room on the second floor with a window facing the south wall. Sunlight, a table, a shelf, a lock on the door. He lined up the pots on the windowsill and sat down on a real bed, his first bed in 7 weeks. Behind him lay the dead slave Kai and the dead Dr. Reed. Ahead lay everything else. The room changed everything. Ethan, for the first time, was able to work without hiding. He asked the Baron clay pots, a lot, linen fabric, wood charcoal, barley, honey, salt. Baron did not ask why. After that, to Lucas, he would this boy whatever he wanted. Ethan set up production. In the room on south wall, there were 14 pots with mold cultures on various stages of growth. Barley decoction, bread decoction, potato broth. He tried various nutritious media and compared the rate of growth and color and the scent of crops. Without a microscope, without spectrophotometer, just the naked nose and 34 years of education. Every morning he checked the pots. He sniffed them. He looked at the light. I recorded my observations with a charcoal pencil on scraps birch bark because that paper in this world was more than silver. Through 2 months he had stable cultures. 3 strains of that produced the most active extract. It rejected the remaining 11. Filtering remained a problem. 4 layers of linen resulted in a cloudy result. Wood charcoal helped, but it wasn't enough. Ethan experimented. River sand, ash, clay. He made a very simple chromatographic column, made a hollow straw, packed layers of charcoal and sand, and passed through it the extract. The result was purer, not perfect, but better. In a normal laboratory, it took Wood 2 days. Here, 2 months. At the same time, with the lab, life on the estate was changing. Lucas was recovering. After 3 weeks after treatment, he got up on his feet. After a month, he began to walk with a cane. After 2, he ran around in the yard and shouted at the dogs like a healthy 8-year-old boy. The scar on his shin remained forever, but my leg still. Baron Varin looked at the sun, and every time when his gaze fell on Ethan, her eyes flashed something that a look of, he didn't understand this boy, a slave who treats just a scholar. 12 years and the hands of a surgeon. Where from? Baron didn't ask. He was smart to not ask. On 3rd month, the Baron summoned Ethan to his office. That was a large room with a stone fireplace and tapestries on the walls. The Baron sat at an oak table, and in front of it lay a parchment. He said that he had signed a release form. Ethan no longer a slave. He is person under the protection of faithful. Can leave whenever he wants to, but the Baron hopes that he will stay. Ethan took the parchment. The letters were unfamiliar, the local script, but the memory, Kaya read it. Free letter. His name. The god of the Baron. He folded the parchment and put away in his bosom, then looked at the Baron and said that he would stay. But he needs more. He needs helpers. People who will do that he says and not ask questions. He needs access to the Devard in order to buy weeds and supplies, and he needs to travel to the village. The Baron raised an eyebrow. Ethan explained. In villages, get sick. Every winter, children die from coughs and heat. Every summer, diarrhea kills infants. This is not the will of the gods. This filth and bad water and insects that spread disease, it may stop it. That's not right away, but a lot. The Baron listened.
He didn't understand half of what he heard, this boy. Little creatures invisible to the eye that cause diseases. Boiling water kills them. Washing hands stops the spread. It sounded like nonsense, but Lucas was running through the yard on 2 feet. The Baron nodded. First assistant was Hilda, the young maid who helped Ethan take care of for Lucas. She saw how he worked. She saw how he was his wounds. I saw how strange, a strange yellow liquid, and the boy is recovering. She didn't understand anything, but believed my own Ethan began teach her. My hands in front of that then touched the patient. Always. Boil rags before dressing. Always. Don't touch the wound with fingers. Never. Hilda listened. She repeated it. She made mistakes. She repeated again. After a month, she was able to change the bandage on her burn, so Ethan just nodded. Thomas became the second assistant, a 14-year-old stable hand, strong and quiet. He wasn't afraid of blood and didn't faint at the smell of pus. Ethan put him in charge of production. Thomas brewed the barley decoction. He monitored the temperature of the pots. He changed the culture medium every 3 days. He filtered the extract through a charcoal column. He did this with a patience and precision that surprised Ethan. Not everyone is born a scientist, but some are born lab technicians. In the 5th month, what Ethan had been waiting for and dreading happened. In the village of Brookmore, a 3-hour ride from the estate, a plague broke out. The village headman rode up to the Baron and fell from his horse right in the courtyard. A bubo the size of a chicken egg was swelling on his own neck. Ethan stood nearby and saw that bubo. The plague. The bubonic form. Yersinia pestis. The mortality rate without treatment is 60%. With the pneumonic form, it's 90%. He didn't have streptomycin. He didn't have tetracycline. His crude penicillin doesn't work well against the plague. Penicillin targets gram-positive bacteria. The plague bacillus is gram-negative. A different cell wall. A different mechanism. All he could do was support the body and hope the immune system would handle it on its own. But there was something else he could do. He could stop the spread. Ethan packed a bag, vials of extract, honey, salt, clean bandages, vinegar for hand sanitization, a knife for lancing the buboes, and 3 assistants, Hilda, Thomas, and a new guy named Gregor, whom the Baron had assigned as a bodyguard. They set out at dawn. The village of Brookmore lay in a low-lying area by the river. 80 people. When they arrived, Ethan counted 7 inhabited houses out of 12 by the smoke rising from them. 5 stood with their doors boarded up. Dead houses. He began by sorting them out. He examined every resident. He moved the healthy ones to houses on the eastern outskirts, farther away from the infected. He divided the sick into 2 groups, those with the bubonic form who could still fight, and those with the pulmonary form, or who were already too weak. He helped the former first. He lanced the buboes, washed the wounds, applied honey, and gave them willow bark decoction to drink to reduce the fever, acetyl salicylic acid in its natural form. It wasn't a cure for the plague, but lowering the fever gave the body time. He couldn't help the second group at all. He could only give them water and make them more comfortable, and close their eyes when they stopped breathing. He lost 14 people in the first week. He remembered each one. Old Irwin, who begged until the very end to have his wife called. His wife had died 3 days earlier. A 6-year-old girl with red pigtails who didn't even cry. She just breathed quietly and then stopped. A young mother who had given birth to a stillborn child 2 days before her death and never found out that the baby hadn't survived. Ethan buried them himself.
He dug the graves with Thomas and Gregor. He rubbed his hands raw. He broke his nails. He stood over the graves and thought. In his past life, these people would have received intravenous antibiotics and been home in a week. Here, he was burying them in the clay. This wasn't despair. It was anger. Cold. Professional. He wouldn't let this go on. At the same time, he was doing what mattered most: quarantine. The healthy must not come into contact with the sick. The belongings of the deceased are burned. Only boiled water is used. Hands must be washed with vinegar after every contact. Fleas are exterminated with wormwood smoke. Rats must be killed. Every rat in the village must be dead. Rats are carriers. Fleas on rats bite people and transmit the plague bacillus. The villagers looked at him as if he were mad. A boy not even 13 years old was ordering them to burn belongings, kill rats, and boil water. But Baron Varone had sent his seal with him, and Gregor stood behind him with a sword at his belt. The villagers obeyed. A month later, Ethan returned to the estate. Of Brookmoor's 80 residents, 60 had survived. 20 had died. 14 in the first week, 6 afterward. Without Ethan, at most 5 of the 80 would have survived. Maybe 10. He had saved 50 lives. He felt no pride. He felt that 20 people were dead because he didn't have proper antibiotics, because his penicillin didn't work on gram-negative bacteria. He needed streptomycin. And streptomycin comes from soil actinomycetes, a completely different organism, a different cultivation technique, a different filtration process. Months of work. Years. He returned to his room, sat down at the table, took a piece of birch bark and a charcoal pencil, and began to write a plan. Not for a week, not for a month, for 10 years. Point 1. Streptomycin. We need soil samples from different places. Forest soil, river soil, field soil. Actinomycetes live in the soil. They must be found and cultivated. Point 2. A vaccine. Killed or weakened bacteria are introduced into the body to train the immune system. For the plague, a pure culture of the pathogen is needed. For that, patients are needed. Or rats. Point 3. Training. Ethan alone cannot save the continent. He needs dozens of people who know how to wash their hands, sterilize bandages, and distinguish the plague from typhus. He needs a school. He wrote until dawn. The birch bark strips piled up to cover the entire table. When the sun rose, he looked at his notes and thought. In his past life, this was called a grant application. Here, it was called a request to the Baron. The essence was the same. Rumors spread faster the plague. The boy healer from the estate Verena. He saved a leg the Baron's son. He rescued the village from ruin. He has and 13, yet he is treating as a 100-year-old monk. To the end, the 8th month, by the gates of the Began. People. People. At first, one at a time, then in families. The peasants with sick children in their arms, elderly people with non-healing ulcers, women with fever after childbirth. They walked on foot for 5 and 10 hours. Some were carrying children who were dead, but still didn't realize that. Ethan examined each one. He set a table in the yard by the gate and was at dawn until nightfall. Hilda stood beside with a bucket of water and clean rags. Thomas carried out the dirty bandages and burned them behind barn. For most, Ethan couldn't help in any substantial. But he did 3 things that had everything. He taught people to boil water. He explained that dirty hands spread disease. He showed how to make a salt solution for cleaning wounds. 3 things, the simplest ones. In his past world, he knew every first grader. Here, it was a revelation. The woman was bringing a child with diarrhea who wouldn't stop a week. The child was dying from dehydration. Ethan gave him drink boiled water with salt and a pinch sugar. Oral rehydration. The simplest procedure that in the 20th century saved millions of children in countries the world. Here, mothers were at him as a saint, when after 2 days the child stopped crying and started to eat. Childbirth fever. Sepsis after childbirth. The killer number 1 for women in this world. Ethan knew why. Midwives attended delivered with hands. That same finger with which just had poken there, they reached into the woman in labor. Streptococcus of A entered into the wort, and through 3 days the woman was dying from fever. Semmelweis proved this in 1847. It was declared insane. He died in the psychiatric hospital. Ethan wasn't to repeat his fate. He did not explain to the midwives the theory germs. He simply said that hands need washed in vinegar before childbirth. Who doesn't washes that anymore doesn't accepts. 2 midwives out of 5 obeyed. The mortality rate of new mothers in their villages has by a factor of 3 over half a year. The rest 3 continued work as before. Ethan was writing down numbers. He kept keeping track. How many patients? How many survived? How many died? From what? Where? When? Epidemiology on the scraps of birch bark. Crude, incomplete, but sufficient to see patterns. In villages by river, diarrhea killed more people than in villages in the hills. So water. In houses where kept goats inside, were less likely got smallpox. So contact with goat pox results in cross immunity. Just with Jenner with cow smallpox. He recorded and thought. On the 9th month to him came Martha, a sturdy woman in her 22 years with dark under her eyes and hands red from doing laundry. She stood up in front of him and said that she wants to work, whatever ever. Wash test tubes, take out the dirty dishes, whatever you want. Just let do. Ethan looked at her and saw. Not illness, something else. Emptiness in the eyes. A person who has nothing to live on. He asked where she was from. Martha replied that from the village Grunwald. What from her had husband? There a son 4 years old. There was a daughter, 2. All 3 died from the plague in 1 month. She survived. She doesn't knows why. She said this in an even voice, without tears. People who have cried it all say exactly that. Ethan nodded. He didn't say her that everything would be. He didn't say that he heals. He said that he needed senior assistant, someone with strong hands and robust stomach, who isn't fears blood and doesn't faint from pus, who will do that he says, exactly, no question. Martha looked at him. A boy, 13 years old, thin, with eyes in which there was anything childish about them. She nodded. There, that day, Martha became his shadow. She learned faster than Hilda and Thomas combined. Within a week, she was changing bandages better than any midwife within 50 miles. Within a month, she could clean a burn wound, apply honey, and bandage it so well that Ethan could only nod in approval. Within 3 months, she was handling simple cases on her own. Cuts, bruises, childhood diarrhea, colds. Ethan checked each of her patients and found fewer and fewer mistakes each time. She had golden hands, precise, confident, the hands of a woman who had worked her whole life and who had finally been given a job that kept people alive instead of killing them. At the same time, Ethan was working on streptomycin. It was 10 times more difficult than penicillin. Actinomycetes grow slowly. They need a specific environment, soil, a certain acidity, a certain temperature. He collected samples from various places: forest litter from under oak trees, river silt, soil from pastures, clay from the bank of a stream. He diluted each sample in boiled water and inoculated it onto culture media. He waited. He watched to see what would grow. Most samples yielded ordinary mold or bacteria that stank and were useless. But in the 4th month of his search, something different grew from a sample of forest soil. White, fluffy mycelium with the scent of earth after rain, characteristic of actinomycetes. Ethan isolated this culture into a separate pot and began to cultivate it. If it was Streptomyces griseus, or a related species, in a few months he would obtain streptomycin, a substance that kills gram-negative bacteria, the plague bacillus, E. coli, salmonella, the very enemies his penicillin couldn't defeat. If it was something else, he would lose half a year's work. There was only one way to find out: to wait. Toward the end of the 1st year, news arrived that changed the entire situation. A messenger arrived from the capital of Astraheim with a letter bearing the imperial seal. The youngest princess, Adelia, had fallen ill. The court physicians were powerless. Her throat was blocked by membranes. The child was suffocating. Emperor Victor Astraheim had already lost his crown prince and 2 eldest daughters to the plague. Adelia is the last one. He was told that on Baron Varen's lands there is a boy healer who performs the impossible. The emperor asks. No. The emperor orders. Baron Varen summoned Ethan to him. He showed him the letter. Ethan read it and fell deep in thought. The throat is blocked by membranes. Diphtheria. Corynebacterium diphtheriae, a gram-positive rod. His penicillin should work on it. But the main problem with diphtheria isn't the bacterium itself, but its toxin. The diphtheria exotoxin affects the heart and the nervous system. Even if the bacterium is killed, the toxin is already in the blood. He needed antitoxic serum, which he didn't have. There was only one thing he could do: kill the bacteria with penicillin so it would stop producing new toxin, remove the membranes from her throat mechanically, and hope that the child's body could cope with the toxin that had already entered her bloodstream. The odds. He ran the numbers in his head, 40 to 60. If he went and the girl died, he would be blamed for her death. The imperial court was not the village of Brookmore. There, mistakes were not forgiven. If he didn't go, the emperor would send soldiers, and they would bring him by force, or they would kill him for disobedience. If he went and the girl survived, he would receive the emperor's patronage, and the emperor's patronage is on an entirely different level. It offers opportunities that Baron Varen, for all his kindness, cannot provide. It means a laboratory, people, resources, protection from the church. Ethan looked at the Baron and said he needed the fastest horse. They rode for 2 days. Ethan, Gregor, and 2 of the Baron's soldiers. Ethan could barely stay in the saddle. Kai's body was resilient for his age, but Ethan hadn't ridden a horse in his past life, and spent the first few hours convinced he'd fall off and break his neck. He didn't fall off. They arrived in the capital at the end of the 2nd day. The city was vast. Stone walls, cathedral spires, the stench of sewage from the streets. The imperial palace stood on a hill above the river. Stone, gloomy, with guards at every door. Ethan was led to the princess through a series of halls that Kay had no memory of. The slave boy had never seen anything like it. The scholar from Boston had seen museums, and he had no interest in architecture. Princess Adelia lay in a huge bed in a room lit by candles and scented with incense. She was 6 years old. Her small body was buried under a pile of blankets. Her face was gray. Her lips were blue. She was breathing with a wheezing sound. Every breath came with effort. Her neck was swollen. Ethan stepped forward and asked for a light. They brought him a candle. He opened her mouth and looked inside. Grayish-white films covered her tonsils in the back of her throat, a classic case of diphtheria. The films were already beginning to block the entrance to the larynx. In a day, the child would be unable to breathe. He turned to the people in the room. 3 court physicians, 2 nannies, a chamberlain, and in the doorway, a motionless figure in gold. The Emperor. Ethan said he needed boiled water, clean rags, tweezers, and he wanted everyone to leave the room except for one nanny. The Chamberlain began to object. Ethan looked him in the eye and repeated himself. Everyone. Out of the room. The Emperor nodded. Everyone left. Ethan remained with the princess and one nanny. He washed his hands with vinegar, he picked up the tweezers, and began to remove the membranes. The films came off with difficulty. They had to the mucus and upon separation began bleed. Ethan worked with tweezers to millimeter, carefully, exactly. Every wrong movement could tear the mucous membrane and open a pathway for both into the bloodstream. Adalia was lying unconscious, and only occasionally, quietly moaned. The nanny held a candle and was trembling. Her hands were trembling, and the light flashed across the walls. Ethan said her to light a candle on table and hold the princesses. The nanny obeyed. It was better. After 20 minutes, he had most of the footage from the oropharynx. The entrance to larynx partly opened, and Adelia took a breath. Deeply. A whistling sound grew fade away. Ethan looked at he had taken. Gray and white films, thick and elastic. Fibrin impregnated with bacteria and dead cells. A classic of diphtheria. He formed films into a clay bowl. Then I rinsed the princesses with a solution from a small pitchers. Drop, drop, so that not choke. After rinsing, I started the main treatment. Penicillin. 3 drops in the mouth every 4 hours. The extract of latest batch. The pure of that he had. He brought with him 2 jars, one for external use, the other for the interior. Take the first dose he administered right just. Bitter taste. Adelia wrinkled even through amnesia. Then he asked for some honey. A spoonful honey after each dose. For the throat and for calories. The girl didn't eat for 2 days. He sat next the bed and began wait. That was the difficult part. Waiting. He did everything he could. The films were removed. What happens, it's up to the body of a child. Will its immune system neutralize the diphtheria toxin, which already in the blood? The toxin affects the muscle. If the damage is critical, then after 3 days, myocarditis, and then no penicillin will help. Ethan listened to her breathing and counted her pulse. Her pulse was rapid, 130 per minute. For a 6-year-old child with a high fever is to be expected. But if myocarditis, the pulse will become irregular, arrhythmia. This will be a sign that the heart is giving out. The night has passed in silence. Ethan did not sleep. Every 4 hours, 3 drops. Every hour, check heart rate. In 3:00 a.m., the opened and the Emperor, alone, without guards, without chamberlain. A man in his 50s, tall, gray temples, eyes reddened from sleeplessness. He approached to his. He looked. He looked at Ethan. Ethan said that the footage were, and breathing is freer. What medication is working? But what the following 2 days will, hellweather heart. The Emperor asked what it meant. Ethan explained it simply. Poison of this disease strikes at heart. The medicine kills creatures that this poison. But that poison that is already inside the cure doesn't reach. The body must heal on its own. The Emperor remained silent. Then he asked the truth if they were that Ethan cured the Baron Verena. And it is that he stopped the plague in village. Ethan replied that true. The Emperor looked at him, at the boy on travel clothing with spots of mold on sleeves, with hands that smelled of vinegar, with eyes that didn't look away their gaze from the Emperor's face. Not single child doesn't like that. The Emperor went out, did not saying anything, a word. In the morning, Adalia's had dropped, with fatal 41 to 30/19. Ethan checked his pulse. 120. Steady. So far, regular. It changed the bandage on his throat. He put on a new dose, rinsed his mouth and throat. The films began to build up again, but more slowly. He took them again. On second day, Adelia opened her eyes, cloudy and confused. She saw the boy standing by her bed and frowned. She tried to say something, but her throat wouldn't let her. Ethan brought her some water with honey. She took 3 sips. That felt good. Her swallowing reflex was working. That meant her nervous system wasn't paralyzed. That meant the toxin hadn't reached her nerves. By the evening of the second day, her pulse had slowed to 110. Her temperature was 38.5. The membranes were no longer growing. Penicillin was killing the diphtheria bacillus faster than it could multiply. The bacteria were losing. The question of her heart remained. Ethan waited. On the third day, he got his answer. Her pulse was steady, rhythmic, no irregularities, no myocarditis. Her heart had held up. Adelia asked for something to eat. He gave her some broth, then some porridge, then more broth. The girl ate eagerly and looked at him with curiosity. She asked the nanny who this boy was. The nanny replied that he was a doctor. Adelia said that doctors are old, but this one is small. Ethan almost smiled. On the fourth day, he was summoned to see the emperor. The throne room. Soaring ceilings with frescoes, columns of gray marble, guards lining the walls, courtiers in silk. And on the throne, a man who hadn't slept for 4 nights because his youngest child was dying. Now that child was eating porridge and asking when he could go for a walk. Ethan stood before the throne, small, wearing unfamiliar clothes they'd given him to replace his travel rags, with his hands behind his back. The emperor announced before the entire court that a boy named Kai had saved Princess Adelia's life, and that for this feat, he was being granted the title of Viscount and lands in the eastern plains of Asterheim. The courtiers began to whisper. A title? For a commoner boy? A former slave? It was unheard of. Some looked on with contempt, others with curiosity, still others with calculation. A boy who can do what no one else can. That's a valuable asset. Or a dangerous rival. Ethan bowed and expressed his gratitude. Then he raised his head and said he had a request. Not a request, a condition. He said that in exchange for the title and the lands, he needed the right to build a hospital, a new kind. He described it: separate wards for contagious and non-contagious patients, boiled linens, hand washing before attending to each patient, clean water, and scientific assistants who would record every patient and every treatment. The courtiers exchanged glances. The imperial physician flushed. The boy had just said, in front of the entire court, that the current physicians were working incorrectly, that their methods killed rather than healed. Not in those exact words, but the meaning was clear. The emperor looked at Ethan for a long time. Then he said one word. So be it. Ethan left the throne room with a parchment bearing the imperial seal, the title of Viscount, lands, and the right to establish a clinic. He looked 13 years old, 35 by the actual count, and he had just received his first real foothold for what he intended to do. On the way back, he thought, not about the title, not about the lands, about the clinic. He mentally drew up a plan: the main building, the admissions ward, the infectious diseases ward, the surgical ward, the maternity ward, the laboratory, a separate one, with a lock, where no one enters without his permission, a storage room for medicines, an ice cellar for storing sensitive extracts, a school attached to the clinic, where he would train assistants, not servants, not slaves, students. People who would understand why washing one's hands is more important than praying. They returned to the Veron estate 3 days later. The Baron met them in the courtyard. He already knew. A messenger had overtaken them. The Baron looked at Ethan and, for the first time, addressed him as "my lord." Ethan grimaced and asked him not to call him that. The Baron smirked. For the first time since they'd met, Ethan saw something resembling a smile on the Baron's face. Ethan went to his room. He checked the pots. The cultures were fine. Thomas had been tending to them diligently. The actinomycete from the forest soil had spread and covered the surface of the medium with a white, fluffy carpet. Ethan took a sniff. The earthy smell had grown stronger, distinctive. It was a good sign. In 2 months, he would obtain the first extract and test it on infected wounds. If it worked, he would have a weapon against gram-negative flora, against the plague, against typhus, against half the diseases that are killing this world. He sat down on the bed and unfolded the imperial parchment. Viscount Kai Reed. He had added his real last name. No one had noticed. No one knew that Reed wasn't just a random word, but the name of a man who had died in oncoming traffic in Boston and woke up in a bed of straw on the other side of reality. Martha's voice drifted in from the hallway. She was scolding Hilda for not boiling the scissors before changing the bandage. Her voice was stern and even, like that of a head nurse. Ethan closed his eyes and thought that in his past life, Martha would have been hired by any hospital in the world the very next day after her interview. Here, she had to bury 3 people just to earn the right to treat others. It's unfair. But it works. He placed the parchment on the table and went to check on the patients. 7 people were waiting in the courtyard. A man with a laceration on his arm from an axe. A woman with a child whose ear was swollen. An old man who was coughing and complaining of chest pain. 4 others. Ethan walked over to the table. Hilda handed him a bucket of water and a clean cloth. He washed his hands and began seeing patients. It was just another day for him. The title of Viscount hadn't changed a thing. The clinic rose over 4 months. Ethan chose a place in the eastern edge of his new lands, hill above the river. The wind from east carries away the scents from residential homes. Water nearby, forest nearby. Stone for walls was from an old quarry and 2 hours away. Baron Veron sent 20 workers. The Emperor sent money. Not much, but enough to get started. Ethan was drawing a plan by himself, with charcoal on large pieces on leather. The main body, 2 wings, left for infectious patients, the right for everyone else. Between them is a wall and a separate entrance. Contagious do not overlap with clean ones. Never. The builders looked at him with puzzlement. Why 2 doors? Why wall inside? Why such so big? Ethan didn't explain. He said, "Do it." They did. At the hospital, he set up a laboratory, a separate building, a stone one, with thick walls that keep the coolness in the summer and warm in winter. 2 windows facing south for light. The door with lock. The only key is it. Inside, he set up tables and shelves. Clay pots with plants were moved from the room to the estate here. Now they're not 14, but 42. Different strains of mold, different media, different stages of fermentation. Actinomycete culture took up a separate corner. It grew slowly, but steadily. White mycelium already has a characteristic of earth, and Ethan was almost sure that this the right one. In a month after the move, he drained the first portion of the extract from the actinomycete culture. The liquid was clearer than penicillin extract. It light slightly tint. The smell earthy and slightly bitter. It filtered through his charcoal column. Then he play at low heat until a quarter of its original volume. The result was 3 spoons. Now let's check. He needs a patient with an infection that penicillin does treat. Gram-negative bacteria. We had to, long. After 2 days, they brought the boy, year 7, from a village across the river. His stomach is bloated. Temperature is 40. Diarrhea with blood is already the 5th day. Mom said that he had been water from ditch. Ethan looked and made a diagnosis based on the symptoms. Bacterial dysentery. Shigella. Gram-negative. Penicillin is ineffective. A classic case for testing. It gave the boy 2 drops of the new extract on a spoon of water and began wait. After 6 hours, the temperature had not track. After 12, it dropped to half a degree. After day, the boy stopped fidget and fell asleep. Diarrhea with blood gave way plain diarrhea. After 3 days, the child asked to eat. On 5th day, he sat on the bed and was looking at window. Streptomycin. A worker, rough and weak and impure, but a hard worker. Ethan stood in the lab and looked at my pots, and at him were hands. No, out of fear, because of the sheer of what he just confirmed. He now 2 antibiotics. Penicillin for gram-positive bacteria, streptomycin for gram-negative bacteria. Together, they cover the majority of bacterial infections that kill people in this world. He can cure the plague, typhoid, dysentery, pneumonia, wound infections, postpartum sepsis. He sat on floor of the game and stared at ceiling. In his past life, Waxman received for the discovery streptomycin the Nobel Prize. Here, Ethan will receive, in the best case, dinner. He laughed hoarsely. Martha peered through door and asked, "Is everything was okay?" He said that yes, what just was tired. She looked at him with look that he had learned to recognize, a look of a person who sees more than is shown. Martha knows, did, said, and left. The clinic opened at full capacity from the beginning of year. Ethan established the rules that seemed to those around him madness. Every entering washes their hands. Everyone, no exceptions, before each patient anew. Laundry is boiled. Bandages are boiled. Instruments are being boiled. Wards are ventilated every day. The floors are washed with vinegar. Patients with fever and a rash are in left wing and don't leave. The assistants who work with infected do not to right wing until change, and will not completely. Result. Mortality at the hospital Etana was at 5 times lower than in any other place on the continent. In city hospitals, people were dying simply from being admitted. They'd come in with a fracture. They'd develop a wound infection. They'd die. At Ethan's clinic, fractures healed, wounds closed, women in labor left alive with their living babies. Rumors spread. People began flocking to the clinic from far and wide, from other baronies, from other counties, from across the border. Eliza Varon arrived at the end of the 2nd year. She was 16, the Baron's eldest daughter and Lucas's sister. Tall, straight-backed. Her dark hair was pulled back neatly. Her eyes were gray and attentive. She entered the clinic and walked silently through the wards for 2 hours. She watched. She listened. Then she found Ethan in the lab and said she wanted to see his records. Ethan looked up from his test tubes and looked at her. Kay's memory recognized Eliza, the owner's eldest daughter, smart and sharp-tongued. The servants were a little afraid of her because she noticed everything and spoke her mind. Ethan showed her the records, birch bark strips with numbers, how many patients had been admitted, how many had been cured, how many had died, material consumption, extract supplies, everything. Eliza read for an hour. Then she looked up and said his records were a mess, that the numbers were scattered, that there was no system, that half of them were impossible to read because the charcoal had smudged across the birch bark. Ethan blinked. She was right. Eliza said she would put things in order. Ethan asked why she was doing this. She looked at him with that same gray gaze and replied that her father had been preparing her to manage the estate, that she could count and run the household better than any steward, that Lucas was growing up and the estate would eventually go to him. She needed a task, a real task, not embroidery and not waiting for a husband. Ethan thought for 3 seconds and nodded. A month later, he didn't recognize his own records. Eliza had set up a system. She obtained parchment through merchants in the capital, and the Baron paid for it. Every patient received a sheet. Name, age, where from, complaints, Ethan's diagnosis, treatment, outcome, date of discharge or death. The sheets were kept in order, by month and by type of illness. Eliza compiled summary tables. How many died of the plague, how many of dysentery, how many from wounds, and in which months the incidence peaked. Ethan looked at these tables and thought that in his past life, Eliza would have become a brilliant epidemiologist, or the head of a clinic. Here, she was a 16-year-old girl who had been given no choice and who had found one for herself. He made her the manager of the infirmary, officially, with a salary. The courtiers in the capital found out and began to whisper. A former slave had appointed a young woman from a respectable family to run the place. Unheard of. Baron Varen said nothing. He knew his daughter, and he knew that Ethan never did anything without a reason. By the middle of the 2nd year, Ethan began work on a vaccine. That was the next step. Antibiotics treat those who are already sick. A vaccine protects those who are still healthy. He knew the principle by heart. A weakened or killed pathogen is introduced into the body. The immune system remembers it. When a real infection strikes, the body is already prepared. But a vaccine requires a pure culture of the pathogen. A plague vaccine requires the plague bacillus. Alive. Cultured. Ethan took samples from Brookmore. Pus from the buboes, tissue from the dead. He stored them in sealed clay pots in the coldest corner of the cellar. Now he was seeding these samples onto culture media and trying to grow a pure culture. It was dangerous, deadly dangerous. He worked with the plague bacillus in a locked room, alone, a vinegar-soaked rag over his face instead of a mask, double-layered leather mittens instead of gloves. If he got infected, his streptomycin might save him. Or maybe not. The concentration was too low. The purity was questionable. But he had no choice. No one but him could do this. He inoculated the samples and waited. And at the same time, he thought about something else. About himself. About his own body. Kai was dying of pneumonia when Ethan entered him. Ethan cured the pneumonia. But Kai's body was emaciated. Scars from beatings, poor nutrition from birth, probably rickets in childhood, judging by the shape of his ribs. This body needed recovery, a process that would take years. Ethan started with nutrition. He knew what nutrients a growing body needed: protein, calcium, iron, vitamins. In this world, there was no word for vitamin, but there were foods that contained them: liver, eggs, milk, greens, fish. He devised a diet for himself and stuck to it strictly. He ate 4 times a day, specific foods in specific quantities. The cook at the sanatorium thought he was crazy. Who demands fresh liver 3 times a week? Who eats raw cabbage? Who gives up beer and drinks only boiled water? The results became noticeable after 6 months. Kai's body gained weight. His shoulders broadened. His skin took on a healthy pink hue, The scars faded. The boy who had looked like a 10-year-old at 12 now looked his age. And a year later, he looked every 14. Ethan looked at himself in the polished copper plate that served as his mirror. A stranger's face. Young. Healthy. His face. His now. He thought about telomerase, about metformin, about rapamycin, about how in 10 years he would begin work on an anti-aging therapy. It was still too early. He was still 14 in a body that needed to grow. But he already knew what he wanted. 300 years, at least. He turned away from the mirror and went to see his patients. Year began with a royal challenge. The emperor sent an invitation. No messenger by an order as in first time. Invitation on parchment with a gold seal. To the Viscount K. Rid was invited to arrive to the courtyard for presentation the nobility. Officially, this was a reception in honor of birthday Princess Adelia. Unofficially, Medalo, the emperor, wanted to show his weapons. Ethan knew that. In a world where heirs die from the plague, a man who knows treat is worth more of 10,000 swords. The emperor wanted all this to be play. He drove off. With We went Eliza as the manager of metal, and Gregor as security, and Martha because Ethan didn't want to leave the clinic without Senior, and took her with him so that On met on the way to discuss the expansion. The capital, Asterheim, looked different than a year ago. Chumu is still hasn't been, but the number of cases has decreased. Ethan saw why. His rules had been compromised. People who have in his clinic returned home and told us. Wash your hands. Boil water. Don't drink from ditches. Do not. Everyone listened. But some did listen, and in those neighborhoods where they listened to the dead, there were fewer. The imperial reception was in a large hall of the palace. 300 people. Lords, counts, barons, their wives and daughters and sons, generals, ambassadors, bishops, and among them, one boy, 14 years in dark blue doublet which had been for a day before departure. Ethan stood by the column and looked at the auditorium. He didn't note celebration. He saw the symptoms. The count with yellow whites of the eyes, liver, countess with trembling hands, thyroid gland, general with a red face and thick neck, blood pressure. A stroke awaits him in 5 years, if not sooner. Baron with gouty nodules on fingers. Uric acid is off the charts. He mentally was diagnoses for other, and quietly, that half of this hall could have saved from death in the next 10 years a simple diet and basic hygiene. Then there was that scene that later became a legend. One of the lords, Count Osterman, tall, haughty, with a voice that is used to two can be heard. He stopped across the room, that the boy was young, to stand among real doctors. What one recovered child is coincidence and not skill. The room fell silent. Everyone were watching. Ethan didn't answer to the words. He did something else. He looked at the Count and saw next to the Count a little girl, about 10, his daughter. He walked over. Calm down. Don't quickly, and not slowly. He stood up in front of the girl. She looked at him from the bottom up with her big gray eyes. Ethan took her hand. He looked at her fingernails, pale, with a slightly bluish tint. That's cyanosis of the nail beds. He looked at the whites of her eyes, clear. He looked at her lips. They were a normal color at rest, but he noticed that as the girl walked from the door to her father, she was breathing faster than was normal for her age. He placed his fingers on her wrist, her pulse. Fast. 110 at rest. That's high for a 10-year-old. And one more thing. He leaned down and put his ear to her chest. A murmur. Systolic. In the second left intercostal space. Aortic valve stenosis, or a ventricular septal defect. Without an echocardiogram, he couldn't say for sure, but the murmur was there. Clear. Functional or organic? That needed to be determined. He straightened up and looked at the Count. The room was silent. Ethan said calmly that the Count's daughter had a heart murmur, that it wasn't dangerous today, but in a few years it could become a problem if left unmonitored. He asked that the girl be brought to him tomorrow, free of charge. The Count stood with his mouth agape. The girl stood with her mouth agape. The room stood with its mouths agape. Ethan bowed to the Emperor and returned to his place by the column. Eliza stood beside him and looked at him with an expression he couldn't read, something between admiration and anxiety. She said quietly that he had just made himself an enemy or an ally, and that she was curious which option the Count would choose. Ethan replied, "Both. First an enemy, then an ally. That's always how it goes when you tell someone the truth about their child." After the reception, a woman approached him, young, slender, wearing a dress made of an unfamiliar fabric. Eastern features. High cheekbones, dark, slightly almond-shaped eyes. Her hair, as black as a raven's wing, was styled into an intricate updo secured with silver pins. She introduced herself, Sula Han, the daughter of the envoy from the Joseon Empire. She said she had seen what he had done, that he had listened to the child's heart with his ear and heard what doctors with stethoscopes cannot hear. Ethan froze. A stethoscope. There are stethoscopes in this world. She noticed his reaction and explained. In Eastern medicine, there is an instrument, a wooden tube with a bell-shaped end. You place it against the chest and listen. But here on the continent, she hadn't seen a single doctor who used one. Ethan looked at her and thought, Eastern medicine, pulse diagnosis, acupuncture, herbs that aren't found on the continent. This woman knows things he needs. She also said she wanted to know how he treated festering wounds, that in her country, wounds are washed with rice vinegar and bandaged with silk soaked in mercury. Ethan nearly choked. Mercury on open wounds. He said he had a better method, that he could show her. She tilted her head slightly. It was an Eastern bow, light and precise. They agreed to meet the next day. The next day changed his understanding of where he was. Sol A arrived in the morning. She brought a leather case with her. Inside were needles, thin, steel, 20 of them, various sizes, and scrolls with drawings of the human body marked with dots and lines, meridians, acupuncture points. Ethan knew about them from his past life. The evidence was weak. The placebo effect explained a lot, but not everything. Pain relief through acupuncture had worked in studies. Stimulation of certain nerve nodes produced a measurable effect. He didn't believe in qi energy, but he believed in the nervous system. And if Eastern medicine had empirically identified points for stimulating peripheral nerves, it would be foolish of him to dismiss it. He showed her his laboratory, pots with cultures, carbon filters, extracts. She watched in silence. Then she asked a question that surprised him. She asked what was growing in the pots. Not like a courtier afraid to ask, like a scientist who wants to understand. He explained. Mold. A fungus. From it, he extracts a substance that kills the organisms that cause decay. She thought for a long time, and said that the books of the ancient physician Zhang Zhongjing mention mold from beans that was applied to wounds. 2,000 years ago. Ethan stared at her. 2,000 years. Empirical observation of the antibiotic effect of mold, 2 millennia before Fleming. On the other side of the world, on a different substrate. He told her that she had just confirmed something very important, that his method was neither a coincidence nor witchcraft, but a pattern that could be found anywhere in the world if one looked closely enough. Sol A looked at him for a long time. Then she said he sounded like someone who knew more than he should. Ethan didn't answer. She didn't press the issue. That evening, they talked late into the night in a mix of the local language and an Eastern tongue, with bits of Latin that they both knew. She taught him pulse diagnosis, 3 positions on the wrist, 3 levels of pressure, 12 pulses. He taught her the basics of hygiene and antiseptics. He explained boiling water and hand washing, and why mercury on wounds kills not only bacteria, but also tissue. She listened. She nodded. She argued. She asked questions that made him forget for a second where he was and when he was. Because that's how colleagues argue in a lab, not student and teacher. 2 equal minds getting to know each other through their craft. Anti-plague vaccine took another half a year. Ethan raised a clean culture Yersinia pestis on meat broth. This was the dangerous thing he did thing all his life. 1 broken glass, 1 drop on skin with a scratch, and he is dead. Streptomycin his batch could not pull system plague infection. He worked at night, when everyone was asleep. The door is locked. A rag soaked vinegar on her face. Double leather gloves. Every movement is perfectly executed. The culture grew well. Cloudy broth with a distinctive smell. He was checking her for sea guinea pigs, which I bought from a vendor in the capital. Little animals were sitting in the cage behind the lab and didn't know what from them depends the fate of the continent. Ethan was them a vibrant culture. They fell and died. Therefore, the pathogen is real. Now we need to weaken it. The principle of vaccination. Killed or attenuated pathogen is administered into the body. The immune system remembers it. The live pathogen must. It will kill it. A weakened is weaker, but safer. Ethan chose the inactivated vaccine. Heating to 60 degrees for over the course of an hour, the bacteria die but retain their membrane, which the immune system recognizes. Without thermometer, 60 degrees is when a finger can find 3 seconds and it burns. Rough, unreliable, but it was there he had. He warmed up the first batch, 3 sea guinea pigs. I waited a week, then administered them same pigs a live, plague-infected stick. 2 of 3 survived. The third got sick, but recovered. Ethan did it again, another batch, another warm-up, preheating, a little longer, a little hotter. On this time, survived all 3. He repeated once time, and again. To the end, the 5th month, of at him was a batch of vaccine that protected sea guinea pigs against the plague in 9 cases out of 10. 9 out of 10. In his past life, this was at a scandal. 90% efficiency. Were the remaining 10? Here, 10% were a miracle. That's that without the vaccine, 60%. Now died 6. The difference in 10 times. There was main question. Do people is not sea guinea pigs. Another is different. Immune response is different. Side effects are different. He needs... There were volunteers. He himself was the first volunteer. Ethan drew up the vaccine into a small syringe. He had made the syringe himself. A hollow needle made of forged steel, and a glass cylinder blown by a glassblower in the capital, according to his blueprints. The plunger was made of polished wood with a leather gasket. A crude instrument, but it worked. He wiped his shoulder with vinegar. He inserted the needle under his skin. He pressed the plunger. A burning sensation. Then warmth at the injection site. 4 hours later, a fever set in. 38. 8 hours later, 38.5. His muscles ached. His head hurt. The injection site was swollen and red. Martha came to check on him that evening and found him in bed with a sweaty forehead and his eyes closed. She asked what had happened. He said everything was going according to plan. She asked, what plan? He said he'd explain tomorrow. She sat down beside him and placed her hand on his forehead. Her hand was cool and rough from work. Ethan thought that in his past life only his mother had touched him like that, when he was 5 and had chickenpox. By morning, the fever had subsided. By evening the next day, he felt normal. The swelling on his shoulder had gone down. A week later, all that remained was a small red spot. 2 weeks later, nothing. Now he had to test the vaccine's effectiveness. He couldn't inject himself with live plague. That would be suicide. But life provided the test itself. A month after the vaccination, he traveled to a village where a new outbreak had begun. He worked with the sick for 3 weeks. He lanced buboes. He cleaned wounds. He breathed the same air. He didn't get sick. The control group consisted of 4 of his assistants who had gone without the vaccine. 2 of them got sick. 1 died. Ethan buried him. The young man's name was Klaus, 20 years old, a farmer's son, a good assistant, precise, meticulous, dead. Because Ethan hadn't dared to vaccinate him before the trip. Because he was afraid of the side effects in humans. He tested it on himself, but not on him. And Klaus died. Ethan stood over his grave, and a single thought kept running through his mind. Every day of delay means someone's death. Every day he plays it safe is a child the vaccine could have saved. He returned and began vaccinating them. Martha, Eliza, Hilda, Thomas, Gregor, everyone who was nearby. He explained that they would have a fever and that it was normal, that the body was learning to fight back. Martha rolled up her sleeve without asking a single question. Eliza asked how the vaccine worked. Ethan explained. Dead creatures are injected under the skin. The body thinks it's a real attack. It prepares its defenses. When the live creatures arrive, the body is already armed. Eliza listened and nodded. She didn't say it sounded crazy. She said it made sense. Ethan looked at her and thought she'd make a great fit for Harvard. By the spring of his junior year, he was ready to scale up. He had enough vaccine for 200 people. Enough syringes, 7 of them. Homemade, but they worked. Enough assistants trained to give injections, Martha, Hilda, and the new girl, Iris Valerie. She'd shown up 3 months earlier, a 17-year-old princess from the southern kingdom of Valoria. The very same girl Ethan had saved from diphtheria when she was 6. Now she was 17 and standing at the clinic's gate with a travel trunk and a note stating that she wanted to become an apprentice and that she had already informed her father after leaving. The guard sent to retrieve her arrived 3 days later. Iris refused to leave. The guards hesitated and then returned home. A diplomatic scandal smoldered for 2 months. Then the king of Valoria sent a letter asking Ethan to look after his daughter and, between the lines, making it clear that if anything happened to her, the Valorian army would cross the border that very day. Ethan replied with a polite letter. Iris stayed. She turned out to be a surprise. Playful, chatty, and impossibly romantic. For the first hour, she cried over every patient. For the second hour, she mixed up her left and right hands while changing bandages. In the third hour, she dropped a vial of penicillin, and Ethan nearly cried himself because that was a week's worth of work. But Iris had 2 qualities that outweighed everything else. Her memory, absolute. She would hear a name once and remember it forever. Ethan explained to her what dose to give for which illness, and a month later she repeated it word for word. And her hands, slender, precise. Once she stopped getting nervous and started working, her hands became the best in the clinic. Better than Martha's, better than Hilda's, almost as good as Ethan's own. He put her in charge of vaccinations, drawing up the syringe, inserting the needle, precisely under the skin, not deeper, not shallower. Iris did it with a surgeon's precision and smiled at every patient so that they forgot to be afraid of the needle. By the end of the 3rd year, the Gray Plague had been halted in Asterheim. Not defeated, isolated cases still flared up, but the epidemic had been broken for the first time in 12 years. 3 neighboring kingdoms sent ambassadors. They wanted the vaccine. Ethan sat across from 3 ambassadors 3 times his age and dictated the terms. The vaccine in exchange for land. The vaccine in exchange for the right to build medical schools. The vaccine in exchange for trade privileges. The envoys looked at the boy, who appeared to be 15, and tried to understand how it had come to pass that the fate of their kingdoms depended on him. They agreed. They had no choice. The church spoke on the 4th year, quietly, without announcements and bull. Sister Helena arrived at the early of fall, 28 years old, a nun from the convent St. Remigius, dark cassock, white collar, hands folded in front him, a calm face with bright eyes. She said that had been sent by the abbess to study methods of the doctor about who so people are talking about. The abbess wants to know if whether his treatment with teachings the one light. Ethan looked at her and understood. A spy. The church sent a scout. A polite one, well-educated, who will watch and listen and report. He could refuse. He could say that the nuns here not belong. I could close the door. But Ethan had realized one thing. Enemies that cannot defeat must be into allies, and church cannot. For now, it is impossible. He invited her in. He showed her around the clinic, the wards, the kitchen, the laundry room with boiling tubs. Helena used to go and watched, silently, intently. She stopped at the wall in the hallway in which Ethan drew with charcoal a diagram, circles and arrows. He explained that this path of blood through the body. The heart pumps, arteries carry it away, veins carry it back, lungs supply with air. Helena stood in front of this diagram 10 minutes. Then she said that in works Galena it is written, says that blood is formed in liver and is used by organs. Ethan said that Galen was wrong. Helena didn't flinched. She didn't crossed herself. She asked where he knew. He replied that if a tourniquet is applied, the artery on arm below the tourniquet, the pulse will disappear. This means blood is flowing from heart to hand along the artery. If tie off a vein, will swell above the bandage. This means blood is flowing from my to the heart through a vein. This can verify right? Right in any person. Helena remained silent for a long time. Then she said that she'd check. She stayed for 2 days, then for a week, then for a month. Ethan didn't interfere her. He let her work beside and watch. She saw as he was his wounds, how he sets up an IV from a suspended skin bag with saline brine, how he listens, breathing, and the pulse, how to disease, by the color of and the smell of urine and the nature of the rash. She read his notes. Eliza gave her access to the archive. Helena was sitting working spreadsheets at night. Numbers. Mortality up to Ethan and after. Mortality in his clinic and in the city hospitals. She had calculated it, recalculated it, double-checked it. The numbers didn't lie. Toward the end of the 2nd month, Helena came to see Ethan one evening. He was sitting in the lab, filtering another batch of streptomycin. She stood in the doorway and said she'd written a letter to the abbess. Ethan asked what was in the letter. She replied that she had written the truth, that Viscount Reed's methods did not contradict the faith because he did not summon demons or recite incantations. He brews potions, washes his hands, boils rags. It's a craft, not heresy. Ethan nodded. A good letter. Then Helena said something else. She said she'd written it because she wanted to be left alone, because she wants to stay here, not to spy, to work. Ethan looked at her. She was standing in the doorway in her dark habit, her hands folded in front of her, and her eyes weren't calm. Her eyes were like those of a person standing on the edge of a cliff, deciding to jump. He asked why. Helena answered. She said she had prayed for the sick for 20 years. For 20 years she had read psalms at the bedsides of the dying. For 20 years she had believed that prayer heals. Here she saw that it wasn't prayer that healed. It was the mold in the pot. A boiled rag. Salt water. The hands of a boy who knew what he was doing. And if that was true, then she had been lying to the dying for 20 years, telling them to pray and God would heal them. God didn't heal. Mold healed. And she couldn't go back to the convent and keep lying. Ethan listened and said nothing. Then he said one thing. He said that if God created this world, then he also created bacteria, and he also created mold. So studying them is a form of prayer, the most honest of them all. Helena stood in the doorway and cried, silently. Tears streamed down her cheeks, and she didn't wipe them away. She stayed. Ethan gave her a job. Helena knew Latin and Greek. She read the ancient authors he hadn't read in this world. Hippocrates, Galen, Celsus, Avicenna. She found treatises in the monastery library that hadn't been opened in centuries. Ethan read them and found grains of truth amid mountains of error. Avicenna described airborne contagion 800 years before the germ theory. Hippocrates insisted on cleanliness and fresh air. Celsus described the signs of inflammation so precisely that Ethan could use his text as a textbook. Helena translated and systematized the works. She became his librarian and archivist, and the world's first historian of medicine. There was tension between them, quiet, unspoken. She was 16 years older than him by local reckoning. In reality, they were the same age. He was a 36-year-old scientist in the body of a 16-year-old boy. She was a 28-year-old nun who had lost her faith and found science. They talked for hours, about God and bacteria, about faith and evidence, about why we should heal a world that is imperfect anyway. These conversations were something Ethan had never experienced in any of his lives, neither in Boston nor here. Understanding, complete, right down to the very bottom. Helena understood him not because she knew his secret. She didn't. She understood because she herself had gone through the collapse of her worldview and survived. And he could see that. And she saw what he saw. They didn't put it into words. Not yet. In the 4th year, something else happened. Cardinal Anselm Weiss, the Grand Inquisitor of the Order of the White Flame. He summoned Ethan for questioning. He didn't arrest him. He summoned him. A polite letter on expensive parchment bearing the order's seal. Ethan arrived at the order's residence in the capital, a stone building with narrow windows, cold inside, even in summer. The cardinal received him in the library. Walls lined with books, thousands of volumes, candles on the table. Anselm Weiss turned out to be nothing like what Ethan had expected. Not fat, not cruel, and not dull. Thin, ascetic, pale hands with long fingers, dark, attentive eyes, a quiet, even voice. He invited Ethan to sit down. Ethan sat down. The cardinal said he had studied Ethan's work, that he was impressed by the results, that he acknowledged Viscount Reed had saved thousands of lives, and that this was precisely why he was dangerous. Ethan asked how a man who heals could be dangerous. The cardinal replied, he said that the church teaches that illness is a trial from the Lord, that the plague is sent as punishment for sins, that healing comes through repentance and prayer. If a boy cures the plague with a pot of mold, then what is the point of prayer? If prayer is unnecessary, then why is the church necessary? If the church is unnecessary, then what is the foundation of order? He said this calmly, without a hint of threat, like a man laying out a logical chain of reasoning. Ethan listened and understood. Anselm is no fool. Anselm sees further than any courtier. He sees that Ethan isn't just healing people. He's changing the very foundation upon which the world stands. And if that foundation crumbles, everything will crumble, including Anselm himself, including everything he's believed in for 30 years. Ethan replied. He said he had no intention of destroying the church, that people need faith, that he heals bodies while the church heals souls, that these are different things, and one does not negate the other. The cardinal listened. Then he smiled, subtly, coldly. He said those were beautiful words, and that he would remember them, and that he would be watching. Ethan stood up, bowed, and left. In the hallway, his hands were shaking. This man was more dangerous than the plague. The plague can be killed with a vaccine. Faith cannot be killed. Chapter 5. Year was the year of without swords. Cardinal Anselm began to take action after 2 weeks after their meeting. Not open, subtle. The first strike came through merchants. 3 merchants who supplied Ethan glass and metal for tools at the same time rejected from their contracts, without explanation. Eliza found out that all 3 had been visited one and the same priest from the order White Flame. The conversation was brief. Who is, with a heretic himself, becomes a heretic. Ethan found other suppliers. Next, it's harder, more expensive, but I found it. Second blow came during the sermons. In 6 cities, Asterheim began say one and that. What? Young Viscount Reed concluded a deal with the dark forces. What? His potion is poison for the soul. What? Those who accepts him treatment turn away from the Lord and will burn in the afterlife word. The people listened. Some believed. A stream of into the hospital decreased by 1/3 over 2 months. Those who came in secret, at night, hiding his face. As if to come to the doctor is crime. Ethan clenched his teeth and continued work. The third blow was personal. Poisoning. Ethan discovered it by accident. His breakfast. Porridge with honey which was brought the maid. He brought a spoon to mouth and stopped. The smell. A faint bitter hint of which should have be. Almond. He knew that smell. Cyanide. Or something from the book of cyanides. Bitter almond. Someone added to his porridge ground grains bitter almonds. Or apricot pits. Amygdalin. In the stomach breaks down into hydrocyanic acid. A lethal dose for a child based on weight is approximately 5 grams grains. In the porridge was enough. He didn't start eating. He didn't make a fuss. Quietly poured the porridge and asked Eliza to check the kitchen. Eliza found it. A new kitchen maid was hired 2 days ago. Recommendation was given by the priest. The girl disappeared in that same miv that Ethan didn't try to look for. She was a tool, but not the solution. The solution lay in stone building with narrow windows and read books. He understood the logic, Anselm's. Every step is calculated. Trade blockade to deprive of resources. Sermons in order to deprive patience. Poison to deprive life. If the first 2 don't work, the third will finish it off. If the third doesn't work, the fourth. Ethan put together his lap. Eliza, Martha, Soul A, who, after a visit, remained at the hospital with permission, her father, the envoy. Iris, Helena, Gregor. They sat in his office that evening by candlelight, and Ethan, for the first time in this life, spoke about politics. He said that the cardinal would not stop, that cannot defeat it, himself, methods. That the church cannot be destroyed because millions of believers stand behind it. That another path is needed. Helena spoke first. She said she knew Anselm, that he wasn't a bad person, that he believed sincerely, and that his fear was not for himself, but for the order of the world. If Ethan is right, and the plague isn't God's punishment, then the thousands of heretics burned over the centuries were burned in vain. Anselm cannot allow that to happen. Not because he's cruel, but because if he does, everything he's believed in his entire life will turn out to be a lie, and he wouldn't be able to bear that. Ethan listened and thought. Helena is right. Anselm isn't a caricatured villain. He's a defender of a crumbling world, his world, the only one he knows. Sol A suggested a workaround. In the Eastern Joseon Empire, religion doesn't interfere with medicine. Monks practice medicine, temples maintain hospitals. Faith and knowledge aren't enemies, but allies. If they could show Anselm that science doesn't threaten his faith, but complements it, he might back down. Ethan shook his head. Anselm wouldn't back down from his words. He needed to be shown, not to tell him, but to show him. The plan came to him at night. He was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, thinking about what the cardinal had said during their meeting. If mold cures the plague, then why pray? What if he turned the question around? What if he showed that mold and prayer aren't mutually exclusive? What if he treated the patient right in front of the cardinal? Not to argue, not to prove anything, just to treat. A man whom the church had written off, in the cardinal's presence, so that he could see it with his own eyes. Anselm would decide for himself what to do next. An opportunity presented itself a month later. Typhus in a monastery on the outskirts of the capital. 7 monks had fallen ill. 2 had already died. The church physicians prayed and burned incense. The monks continued to die. Ethan arrived uninvited. He arrived because he'd heard about the outbreak and came on his own. With a bag of vials and Martha and Hilda. They wouldn't let him past the monastery gates. He identified himself. They sent for the abbot. The abbot came and said there was no place for a heretic in the holy monastery. Ethan stood at the gate and waited. An hour later, another dead body was carried out of the monastery. A young monk, about 20 years old. They carried him past Ethan on a stretcher, and Ethan saw his face. Gray. Eyes open. 20 years old. Ethan turned to the abbot and said that there were still 5 living ones inside, that in 3 days there would be 3, in 5 not a single one, that he could save them, right now. But if the abbot said no, then let him dig the graves himself. The abbot looked at the dead monk being carried off to the cemetery, then at Ethan. Then he crossed himself and opened the gate. Ethan entered, and there Anselm Weiss was waiting for him. The cardinal stood in the monastery corridor in the order's white cassock. He had arrived earlier. He knew Ethan was coming. He wanted to see him. Ethan looked at the cardinal. The cardinal looked at Ethan. Neither of them said a word. Ethan walked past him into the ward. 5 monks lay on straw mattresses. Fever, a rash on their stomachs, roseola, characteristic of typhoid fever, Salmonella typhi, gram-negative, streptomycin. He began to treat them, in front of the cardinal. He washed them. He gave them water. He dripped streptomycin into the water and gave it to them to drink. He changed the wet cloths on their foreheads. Martha worked nearby. Hilda boiled the linens. Anselm stood by the wall and watched. He didn't leave. He didn't interfere. He watched. 3 days. Ethan hadn't slept for 3 days. Neither had Anselm. The cardinal stood or sat in the corner of the ward and watched every movement of the boy who was treating his monks with mold and boiled water. On the morning of the 4th day, the most seriously ill monk opened his eyes and asked for bread. Anselm watched. By the 7th day, all 5 were sitting up in their beds and eating. Not a single one had died. Ethan packed his bag. He stood before the cardinal, and he said one sentence. He said that God had given him hands and a head, and that he was making use of what God had given him. Anselm did not reply. Ethan left the monastery and departed. A week later, news reached him. Cardinal Anselm Weiss resigned from his position as Grand Inquisitor, without explanation, without a scandal. He simply wrote a letter of resignation and left. A month later, Ethan found out where he was. Anselm was working as an orderly at a sanatorium, at Ethan's sanatorium. He came at night. He knocked on the servant's door. He asked to be given any kind of work, mopping floors, emptying chamber pots, anything. Martha hired him. She didn't know who he was, just a new orderly, thin, not young, with hands unaccustomed to dirty work. He mopped the floors and carried out the dirty laundry, and spoke to no one. Ethan found out 2 weeks later. Eliza reported that a former priest had joined the staff, one who worked silently and diligently and didn't bother anyone. Ethan came and saw for himself. Anselm was on his knees, a rag in his hands, washing the floor in the ward for the contagious. The former Grand Inquisitor, the man who used to decide who would live and who would burn, on his knees, with a rag. Ethan stood in the doorway and watched. Anselm looked up. Their eyes met. Anselm said quietly that he was begging for forgiveness from everyone he hadn't saved because he'd been afraid to understand. Ethan nodded. Then he turned and walked away. In the hallway, he leaned against the wall and closed his eyes. He looked 16. He was 36 in reality, and he had just won a war that could have destroyed everything he had built. He didn't win with a sword or with cunning. He won with the only thing he had, the truth that heals. 8th year brought Ethan his first real war. Not a religious one, a military one. The kingdom of Drakenholm in the west has decided that it would be easier to take the doctor by force than pay for the vaccine with land. King Sigmund of Drakenholm gathered 4,000 soldiers and marched them toward the border of Asterheim. Official reason was ridiculous. Violation of the contract. Everyone reason was known to everyone. Sigmund had lost 2 sons to the plague. His 3rd was sick. And Sigmund wanted Ethan, alive, by his side, forever. Ethan learned of the march 10 days before the army arrived. Eliza received a report from merchants at the border. 4,000. Cavalry, infantry, siege engines. Facing them, Asterheim had the imperial army. 12,000. But scattered across garrisons, it was impossible to assemble it at the point of attack in 10 days. The nearest garrison, 2,000 soldiers at Hallberg Fortress, was a 4-day march away. The emperor had sent an order to hold their ground. Reinforcements would arrive in 12 days. Ethan sat in his office and thought. Not about tactics, not about fortifications. He thought about what he knew better than anyone else on this continent. Diseases. Drakenholm's army had been marching for 10 days, 4,000 men, camps in the open, communal latrines, shared water from rivers and streams, flies, mud, unwashed hands. Ethan knew what happened to any medieval army on the march. Dysentery, typhus, cholera if they were unlucky. Diseases kill more soldiers than swords, always, in every war before the 20th century. He wasn't going to spread disease. He wasn't a bioterrorist. He was a doctor. But he could have waited. Drakenholm's army reached the border on the 7th day of the march. By that point, they already had 200 sick soldiers. Dysentery, just as Ethan had expected. Dirty water, unwashed hands, flies on the food. Classic. By the 9th day, there were 500 sick. By the 10th, 700. The army was losing men not in battle, but in the latrines. Ethan rode out to Drakenholm's camp on the 11th day, alone, without an escort, on a chestnut mare carrying a white flag. Soldiers at the outposts nearly shot him with a crossbow. They brought him to the commander of the vanguard. The commander looked at the boy of about 18 on a scrawny horse and asked who he was. Ethan identified himself. Viscount Kai Reed, chief physician to the crown of Asterheim, the very one your king wants to take away. The commander turned pale and sent for the general. The general sent for the king. Sigmund of Drakenholm received him in the commander's tent, a burly man with a red beard and fierce eyes. Standing beside him was a physician who looked as if he hadn't slept in a week. It was clear why. 700 sick soldiers. Ethan said one thing. He said the king had 2 options. Option 1, continue the march. In 5 days, he'll have 2,000 sick soldiers. In 10 days, half the army will be down. In 12 days, the imperial army will arrive and finish off what's left. Option 2, Ethan treats his army. Right now. 700 sick soldiers. Streptomycin, rehydration, quarantine. In a week, the army will be back on its feet. In exchange for peace. Complete peace. With the signing of a treaty. With the withdrawal of troops. And with Ethan's right to build medical schools on Drakenholm's territory. Sigmund looked at the boy standing before him, unarmed and fearless, dictating terms to a king with an army of 4,000. The boy who could save his 3rd son. The boy without whom this 3rd son would die just like the first 2. Sigmund agreed. Ethan treated the Drakenholm army for 10 days. He had brought a supply of streptomycin with him and taught Sigmund's military doctors basic hygiene. Boiling water, washing hands, separating the sick from the healthy. The simplest of things. Life-saving things. Of the 700 patients, 23 died. The rest recovered. The army disbanded and went home. A month later, Ethan arrived in Drakenholm and cured Sigmund's 3rd son. Scarlet fever, streptococcus, penicillin. The boy was healthy within a week. Sigmund stood before Ethan and said nothing. Then he remarked that Viscount Reed was a strange man, that a normal person, after being poisoned and attacked, would have sought revenge. Ethan replied that revenge does not heal. Sigmund smiled wryly and signed everything Ethan asked for: the right to establish medical schools, trade privileges, land along the border, and a personal non-aggression pact valid for 50 years. By the end of the 8th year, Ethan controlled medicine in 3 kingdoms: Asterheim, Valoria, through Iris and her connections to her father, and Drakenholm, through a treaty with Sigmund. The 4th kingdom, Kalon, in the southeast, sent an embassy of its own accord. They needed a smallpox vaccine. Ethan was already working on it. Cowpox, Jenner's principle. Pus from pustules on a cow's udder is injected under a person's skin. A mild illness. Cross immunity. Protection against smallpox. He tested it on volunteers. It worked. The smallpox vaccine was simpler than the plague vaccine. There was no need to cultivate the pathogen. It was already present in every cowshed. All that was needed was to collect it properly and administer it correctly. Iris became the head of the smallpox vaccination program. She traveled around the villages with 2 assistants and a box of syringes. At first, the villagers were wary. A princess with a needle who pricks children in the shoulder and promises they won't get sick. It sounded like witchcraft. But the children didn't get sick. And in neighboring villages where Iris hadn't been, children were covered in sores and dying. A year later, there was no need to persuade anyone. People stood in line. Ethan watched it all from his office. On a map of the continent, he marked the locations where his people were working. Clinics, schools, vaccination centers. The dots were multiplying, slowly but unstoppably. He looked 20. He was actually 36, and he was just getting started. The 12th year. Ethan, 24 out by time. He looked about 20. I noticed wasn't Eliza. The first noticed Ji-won. He picked her on 8th year, during a typhus epidemic in the port city of Rheinhafen. A 15-year-old orphan, filthy, emaciated, with a knife tucked into her belt and the look of a cornered animal. She lay in a ditch with a fever of nearly 40, slashing at anyone who tried to touch her. Ethan crouched down beside her. She swung the knife at him. He didn't flinch. He told her she had typhus and that she would die in 2 days, and that he could change that if she let him. Ji-won looked at him and said that everyone lies. Ethan replied that he was lying too, but not about the typhus. She laughed hoarsely and lost consciousness. He cured her with streptomycin in a week. Then he discovered an anomaly. Ji-won had an extremely rare mutation in her blood clotting system. Her clotting factor worked differently than everyone else's. She should have bled to death from her first serious injury as a child. She didn't. Her body compensated for the defect in another way, an alternative clotting cascade. Ethan studied her blood for months under a primitive microscope he'd built himself. 2 polished lenses in a brass tube, a crude instrument providing 40 times magnification. That was enough to see blood cells. He looked at Ji-won's blood and the blood of healthy volunteers and compared the rate at which clots formed. The difference was obvious. Ji-won learned of his interest in her blood and decided that she was broken, that her body was a mistake, that this was why she'd been abandoned as a child. She told him this one night in the kitchen when he caught her stealing bread in their 3rd year of knowing each other. She was still stealing, an orphan's habit. Ethan sat down next to her and said she wasn't broken, that she was unique, that her blood was the key to understanding how clotting works in all people, that he could unravel the mechanisms that would save thousands of people from bleeding to death simply because she had this trait. Ji-won chewed on the stolen bread and looked at him from under her eyelashes. Then she asked if it was true. He said it was. She said she believed him, but she'd still steal bread. 4 years after they met, Ji-won was 19. Ethan was 24, according to his ID. She lived at the clinic and worked as his personal assistant, a lab assistant, an assistant, a test subject in the sense that she regularly donated blood for his research and, in return, was granted the privilege of yelling at him when he forgot to eat. She was the first to notice because she saw him every day for 4 years. And in the 4th year, she realized he hadn't changed. Not a single wrinkle, not a single gray hair. His face was exactly the same as when she first saw him. She was 15 and he was 20. Now she was 19 and he was still 20. She came to his lab that evening and stood in the doorway, silently, for a long time. Ethan looked up from the microscope and looked at her. She asked, "How old are you?" "Really?" Ethan froze. For 4 years he'd lived next to this girl and waited for that question. He knew that someday someone would ask. He just didn't think she'd be the first. He could have lied, said it was the herbs, that it was good nutrition, that it was a peculiarity of his body. He looked at Ji-won, at the girl who had stabbed him with a knife in the ditch, whom he'd saved from typhus, who'd been stealing bread for 3 years, who'd given him blood every week, and who'd yelled at him when he didn't eat. He couldn't lie to her. He said, 36. If you count it another way, it's much older. She stood in the doorway, processing it all. Then she asked, "You're not from around here?" He replied, "No." She asked, "You won't grow old?" He replied, "Most likely not." She asked, "What about us?" He didn't answer. She understood without an answer. Jiwan left and didn't speak to him for 3 days. On the 4th day, she came to the lab and said she didn't care, whether he was an alien or a demon or whatever, that he'd saved her life and told her she wasn't broken, and that was enough, and that if he thought she'd tell anyone, he was a fool. Ethan looked at her and said nothing. Then he nodded. The first person who knew the whole truth. A month later, he told Elise. She wasn't surprised. She said she'd figured it out a long time ago, that a boy who, at 12, could treat patients like a 100-year-old scientist couldn't be an ordinary boy, that his face hadn't changed in the 6 years she'd known him, that she'd been waiting for him to tell her himself. Ethan asked if she was afraid. Elisa looked at him with her gray eyes and replied that she was afraid, but not of him. She was afraid of what they would do to him if others found out. Then she asked how long he planned to live. He said 300 years, maybe longer. Elisa was silent for a long time. Then she said that must be very lonely. Ethan replied that it was. Elisa took his hand, for the first time in all those years. She just took his hand and held it, without saying a word. By the end of the 12th year, 3 people knew about his immortality: Jiwon, Elisa, and Sola. He hadn't told Sola. She'd figured it out on her own. One evening, during their usual conversation about medicine, she mentioned in passing that in Eastern legends there are immortal sages who live for centuries and teach people, and that she had never believed in these legends, until recently. Ethan looked at her. She looked at him. They understood each other without words, as always. The 25th year. According to his papers, Ethan was 47. He looked 25. Gray temples, which he dyed every morning with walnut decoction. Glasses he didn't need. A slight limp in his left leg, which he faked with a pebble in his boot. A disguise. Cheap, but in a world without photographs, it worked. His title had grown. Duke Ethan Reed of Asterheim, Chief Physician to the Crown, Advisor to the Emperor, Landowner in 4 kingdoms, Founder of 12 hospitals and 6 medical schools, the man who stopped the Grey Plague. The continent of Westalia looked different than it had 25 years ago. Unrecognizable. Every major city had a new kind of hospital, with boiled linens, with hand washing, with separate wards for the contagious. Maternal mortality had fallen 4-fold. Infant mortality under the age of 5 had been cut in half. Smallpox was on the retreat. The plague was no longer a death sentence. Typhus was treatable. Dysentery was treatable. Wound infections were treatable. People lived to old age and died of old age, not of pus and fever. Ethan stood on the balcony of his palace in the capital and looked out over the city. A city that smelled not of sewage, but of smoke from chimneys and fresh bread. Sewer systems. He had built the capital's first sewer system in the 15th year. The Romans had known this 2,000 years ago. Here, he had to explain it all over again. Behind him was a hall, a large one, with a long table. Seated at the table were his people. Eliza, 51 years old, gray strands in her dark hair, a straight back, a gaze as sharp as it was when she was 16, the administrator of all his lands and hospitals. She never married. Ethan never asked why. He knew. Sol A, 54. Fine wrinkles around her eyes. Silver pins in her hair, which has turned gray at the temples.
head of the Eastern Medical School she founded in the capital, author of a treatise on pulse diagnosis that became the standard across the continent. Martha, 47, sturdy, broad-shouldered, hands marked with small scars from her work, head nurse at the central clinic, mother of 2 adopted children, a boy and a girl whom she took in from plague-stricken villages and raised as her own. She named the boy Klaus, in memory of that young man. Iris, 42, still cheerful, still with steady hands, the continent's chief vaccinator. She vaccinated more people against smallpox and the plague than anyone else in the history of this world. Her portrait hung in every hospital. Helena, 53. She took off her habit 10 years ago. She wore a dark-colored, secular dress. Librarian and archivist. She wrote a history of medicine from antiquity to Ethan, 8 volumes, in Latin and the local language, a work that will outlive them all. G1, 36. Tough. Straightforward. With a scar on her cheekbone from a fight at the port where she went to buy supplies and where someone decided a woman could be cheated. They didn't try that again. She ran the research lab, the only one besides Ethan who worked with live pathogen cultures. They were all sitting at the table, looking at Ethan, who was standing on the balcony and looked 25. All 6 of them knew. He told each of them himself. Except for Sol A, who understood without words, and Helena, who one night told him that if God had sent an immortal to heal mortals, it was the cruelest and most beautiful mercy of all possible. And she cried, and Ethan hugged her, for the first time in all those years. They didn't talk about it in front of others. Never. To the world, Duke Reed was simply a man with good genes and a healthy lifestyle. Herbs, diet, exercise. People believed it. People always believe in simple explanations. But Ethan knew that time was working against him. In 10 years, it would be impossible to keep up the pretense. In 20, it would be absurd. He needed a plan. He had already been working on it. The first death, a staged event. Duke Reed would fall seriously ill. A long illness. Behind closed doors. Then a funeral. Then, a year later, a young man would appear, the late Duke's grandnephew, strikingly similar, with the same knowledge, with the same manners. Eliza will draw up the family tree. Sul-Ah will confirm it before the court. The Council of Nobility will pretend to believe it. Some will actually believe it. It's easier for people to believe than to doubt. But that's later. Right now, it's the 25th year, and sitting at the table are the people he loves, who are growing old, who will die. Every smile at this table is already a farewell. He knew that from day one, and he loved them all the same. Martha looked up and said that dinner was getting cold. Ethan turned away from the balcony and sat down at the table. Iris was telling a story about how a village headman ran away from a needle, jumped over a fence, and got stuck. Jiwan snorted. Helena smiled. Eliza shook her head. Sol-Ah poured him some tea. He drank and watched them, committing everything to memory. Every face, every wrinkle, every gray hair. 300 years from now, he would remember this lunch. Every second. The 60th year. Ethan buried Kai. Not that Kai. Not the slave boy whose body he had inhabited. Another one. Kuznetsov's son from the village of Brookmore, whom Ethan had saved from dysentery in the 5th month of his life here. That boy grew up and named his firstborn Kai, in honor of the doctor. That Kai grew up and named his firstborn Ethan. That Ethan grew up and named his firstborn Kai. And so the cycle continued. 3 generations, 60 years, a line of names like a chain of memory. But this year, the first Kai died, the eldest, that very same boy, who was now 72. He died at his home in Brookmore, in bed, surrounded by his children and grandchildren. His oldest grandson, 10 years old, sat at the head of the bed and held his grandfather's hand. Ethan had arrived the day before the end.
Kai lay propped up on pillows, his hair completely gray and completely still. He looked at Ethan and smiled. He said Ethan hadn't changed a bit. Ethan sat down beside him and took his hand. There was nothing he could do. Kai wasn't sick. Kai was old. 72 years is a long time in this world. In Ethan's world of sanatoriums, it had become possible. Without them, Kai would have died of dysentery at the age of 7. Ethan had given him 50 years of life. And now he sat beside him, holding his hand, knowing that all those 50 years would have been worth nothing if he hadn't given them. Kai died at dawn, quietly, in his sleep. Ethan sat by the coffin all night, alone. The children and grandchildren had gone to bed. The candles were melting. Outside the window, the sky was growing light. Ethan sat there and, for the first time in both of his lifetimes, wept. Not out of grief, out of the weight of it all, out of the weight of all the names he remembered, all the faces, all the hands he had held as they grew cold. He wept because he could, because tears are the only thing left to the one who outlives everyone. In the morning, he got up, wiped his face, went outside. The village of Brookmore looked different than it had 60 years ago. Stone houses instead of wooden ones, wells with covers, paved streets, a school, a clinic. Not a single boarded-up, abandoned house. He had done it, with these hands, with this mind. 30 years after Kay's funeral, Ethan staged his first death, the year 1990. According to his documents, he was 102. He looked 25. The disguise had stopped working 15 years earlier. He shut himself away in his chambers. He announced that he was seriously ill. Eliza had died by then, 4 years ago, quietly, in her sleep, just like Kai. 85 years old. She had managed his affairs until her very last day. Until her very last day, her back remained straight. Until her very last day, her gray eyes saw everything. Martha had died even earlier, at 73, heart failure. Ethan was by her side. He held her hand and felt her pulse slow and then stop. Hands that had bandaged thousands of wounds, that had held his elbow that day in the square when they announced the victory over the plague, that had rocked their 2 adopted children. They stopped. Sol Ah passed away at 76. She had returned to the East in the 60s. She said she wanted to die at home. Ethan saw her off at the port. She stood on the deck and looked at him from the ship. He stood on the pier and looked at her. Not a word, just a nod, just like the first time. A year later, a letter arrived from one of her students. Sol Ah had died in her family's ancestral temple, surrounded by her family. She was one of those who knew the truth until the very end and never let a word slip. Iris lived to be 79. She kept giving vaccinations until the very end. In her final year, her hands were already shaking, and her students gave the shots for her while she stood nearby and smiled at every child. Just like on the first day, she died with a smile, literally. Helena was the last to leave the first circle, 81 years old. She finished writing the final volume of the History of Medicine a week before her death. The last line in the final volume was written in such steady handwriting as if she were 28 and had just arrived to spy on the sanatorium. Ethan read that line, closed the book, and put it on the shelf. Jiwon outlived them all, 83, tough to the very end. She scolded the young lab assistants right up until her last day. She was the only one who told him straight to his face as she said goodbye. Don't you dare stop. You promised 300 years. Keep your word. He buried them all, one by one, and after every funeral, He returned to the lab and continued working, because he had promised. The staged death went off without a hitch. The funeral, the closed casket, the mourning. A year later, a young man appeared, the late Duke's grandnephew, strikingly similar. The Council of Nobility looked at him and pretended to believe it. Some actually did believe it. The new Duke took over his predecessor's affairs and continued his work, as if nothing had changed. Because nothing had changed. Only the name, the 300. Morning. The balcony over the city. Ethan stood and looked down. The city was called Asterheim, as and 300 years ago. But then they didn't matched. Stone paving stones, water supply, sewer system, gas streetlights at intersections. Lamps he introduced 30 years ago when I found a way to produce light gas from coal. Horses still clattered their hooves on pavement, but next to with them rolled the first steam carts. Rough, noisy, slow, but authentic. In the square in front of the palace stood the grate of the academy. 3 floors, columns, wide windows. Inside, 300 students, medical students, chemists, biologists, engineers. First university on the continent, founded 20 years ago. Across from the academy stood the Central Hospital, the 5th building behind 3 centuries. Each subsequent was than the previous one. In this clinic, there were 200 beds. The operating room, with metal instruments which were sterilized with steam, the laboratory, with microscopes that provided magnification of 400 times, X-ray machine, more yet. But Ethan already knew how to build it. After 10 years, maybe 15. He wasn't in a hurry. He never didn't in a hurry. On the wall of the balcony sat a sparrow. Ethan looked at it and thought that this sparrow, great-grandson of that sparrow who was sitting on window his first room in the estate of Arena. Sparrows live 2 years. For 3 centuries there have been 150 generations of sparrows, and 1 generation of Ethan. He turned and entered into the room. On table lay documents. Government papers signed King Ethan V. To him, by the documents, 23. In reality, 334. He changed names and faces every 40 years. 5 times he died. 5 times he came back. Great-nephew, distant relative, adopted son. Each time, advice of the nobility made pretend that he believed. To the 3rd time, they stopped even trying pretend. They simply accepted it. That's that the person who doesn't grows old, and who built everything around them has the right to call itself whatever it pleases. The continent Westalia was a single state as early as 150 years, not conquered, united, through treaties, through trade, through medicine, through schools. Every kingdom joined voluntarily because that within a single state children did not die from smallpox, and their mothers did not during childbirth, and the elderly lived out to 80. The person of the light existed, reformed. The Inquisition was dissolved 200 years ago. Churches stood side by side with hospitals, and priests blessed doctors before surgeries. Helena would have been happy. Vera and science more know at war. Ethan sat at the day and opened his notebook. Not a government one, a personal one. Thick, made of leather cover. He kept this notebook for 300 years. Not just one, a stack, 72 volumes. In the first volume, on the first page, written in Kai's childish handwriting, were the words, Penicillin, Batch 1, Barley Broth Substrate, Date, Temperature, Result. He opened the last volume to a blank page and wrote the date. The 300th year since the awakening. Then he set down his pen and fell into thought. 300 years. He remembered every single one. Not every day, but every year. The first year. Straw. A cough. Mold in a pot. Brigitte the cook. The stable. Little Lucas with his black leg. The Baron on his knees. The room with the south-facing window. The fifth year. The square in front of the cathedral. The Emperor on the balcony. Eliza with a magazine. Iris with a box of ampules. Martha with a baby. Sol A in an oriental dress. Helena in evening wear. He told them back then. Well, here we go. The 12th year. Ji-won in a ditch with a knife. Her voice. Everyone lies. His reply. I'm lying too, but not about typhus. The 60th year. Kai, a 72-year-old man. A smile. You haven't changed a bit. A candle by the coffin. Tears. The 90th year. Eliza, gray eyes, a straight back. Until the very last day, he remembered everyone, every name, every face, every hand he'd held. Students, patients, the children he'd saved, the children he hadn't saved. He remembered them, too. The little girl with red pigtails in Brookmore who stopped breathing during his first epidemic. Klaus, who died of the plague because Ethan was afraid to vaccinate him. Everyone. He closed the notebook. He stood up. He walked over to the window. Down below in the square, life went on as usual in the morning. Merchants were opening their stalls. Students were walking to the academy with books under their arms. A woman was leading a child of about 5 by the hand. The boy was healthy, rosy cheeks, strong legs. He was tugging his mother toward the fountain and laughing. This boy won't die of smallpox. He won't die of the plague. He won't die of dysentery. He'll live a long life and die an old man in his bed. Because 300 years ago, a boy slave grew mold in a clay pot in the corner of a stable. Ethan looked at this child and thought, it seems to have worked. Not perfectly, not completely. The world is still imperfect. People still get sick and die. But they no longer die from things they shouldn't die from. They don't die from a midwife's dirty hands. They don't die from water from a ditch. They don't die because a priest told them to pray instead of seeking treatment. This isn't paradise. But it's a world where science isn't heresy, a doctor isn't a sorcerer, and a peasant's child lives to a ripe old age. He turned away from the window. There was a knock at the door. A young secretary entered with a folder of documents. Your Majesty? Morning business. Ethan sat down at the desk. The first document, a report from the Western Province. A new clinic has been built. It has begun operations. The staff is fully staffed. The mortality rate in the region has dropped by 12% in the first quarter. He signed it. The second document, a request from the Academy. A 5th-year student is requesting permission for an expedition beyond the southern mountains to collect soil samples. New actinomycetes, new antibiotics. Ethan smiled. He signed it. The third document, a letter from the chief physician of the capital's hospital. A young woman, 32 years old, the best surgeon of her generation. Her name was Martha. Not that Martha, a different one, but with the same hands. She had written about a new method of pain relief during surgery, ether anesthesia. She was requesting permission to conduct trials. Ethan read and nodded. 300 years ago, he had filtered mold through a woman's bonnet. Today, his students were discovering anesthesia. He signed it.
The secretary took the papers and left. Ethan was left alone. He stood up and walked over to the wall. Portraits hung on the wall, 6 of them. Eliza, gray eyes, straight back. Soul A, silver pins, a quiet smile. Martha, strong hands, rough from work. Iris, laughing eyes, deft fingers. Helena, a dark dress, a book in her hands. Jiwon, a scar on her cheekbone, a sidelong glance. 6 women, 6 lives, all over. He stood before the portraits and reminisced. Eliza, who took his hand and held it in silence. Soul A, who nodded at the pier and left forever. Martha, who placed a plate in front of him without a word. Iris, who cried with happiness in the square during the 5th year. Helena, who said that studying bacteria is a prayer. Jiwon, who said, "Don't you dare stop." He didn't stop. 300 years. He hadn't stopped for a single day. He turned away from the portraits and stepped out onto the balcony. The city lay below, alive, noisy, thriving. The boy by the fountain was still laughing. Ethan stood on the balcony and thought about what lay ahead of him. Another 300 years, maybe more. New faces, new names, new students whom he would raise and bury. New discoveries, electricity, X-rays, a new generation of antibiotics, heart surgery, genetics. Maybe one day he'd get to where he'd started in his past life. Telomerase, DNA, cellular aging. Maybe one day he'll be able to give others what he gave himself. Time. But that will come later. Right now, it's morning for him. The sun, the city, and a boy laughing by the fountain. Ethan rested his hands on the stone railing of the balcony. The stone was warm from the sun, just like that stone at the Verena estate 300 years ago, when he walked barefoot across the courtyard to the Baron to ask for 2 days for his son. Warm stone, the same world, a different world. His world. He looked at the city once more. Then he turned and went inside. To work. Because 300 years isn't the end. It's only the first chapter.